All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. I'm your host, Dr. D. Today, we're going to talk about why nobody tells us the truth anymore. State capacity, the limitations, and when you and I are on our own. So sit back, grab yourself your favorite beverage. Let's get at her. Welcome back. Listen, we know the government always tells us the truth. I know you're laughing at that. It's not a shot at any specific politician. It just seems at one time or another, we find out a little bit later that you get a little bit of the truth, a little bit of variables thrown in there, and maybe a little secret sauce poured all over top of it with a spice of salt to just give it a little bit of flavor so that it's exactly what somebody wants to hear, but not maybe 100% of what really is going on. It's about communication. Communication is as old as our species. Our ability to successfully exchange ideas, get together, determine ways forward, etc. It's based upon each of us saying things out of our mouths or typing them on a computer in today's technology and putting them out in the ether, and whether or not those things are in fact true. What a novel concept. So today what we want to talk about is the idea that a social contract exists between the state and the governed population, that it's very good to be there. It's there for very good reasons. It needs to be funded by taxation, and it's all supposed to work really, really well. But there are always going to be limitations to what the state can do for you, and that we do not do a very good job of communicating where those limitations are, and then what is expected to occur or what is likely to occur when those expectations or those limitations are breached. So that's what we're going to talk about today, because it's very, very important, because I think we're starting to see some cracks in the system across different political spheres, different governments. Again, this is not ideologically grounded. It's just there is always going to be a gap between the expectation of the population. Now, whether that's grounded in truth, whether that's grounded in reality, or the population itself has an outsized expectation or belief as to what the government can do. And then there's the idea that there is an actual limitation to what the government can do, irrespective of what may be told, irrespective of what they may want to be able to set out to the world. There is always a limitation. There is always a point at which the government can no longer deliver the services that they've agreed to deliver to the population. And at that point, in whatever genre or whatever field of service you want to talk about, the population is on their own. From that point forward, they literally have to figure it out by themselves. That point exists in every service as part of the social contract. So let's get into it. Now, this is based upon that old adage that we learned when we were young, that if you tell the truth, you'll cause pain once and you'll never need to remember anything. If you lie, then you'll have to repeat claims, consistently remembering what was said in which context, adding considerable mental stress to the average day. Fairly simple, and something we've all likely ascribed to some degree. Now, if you look at modern democracies, a social contract exists between the government and the population. There are a number of tasks or services that cannot be completed by the individual. Hence, the collective transfer that responsibility to an elected body, which is supported, they actually do the work, supported by a public service, in exchange for funding that service through taxation. Simple idea, which over the decades has expanded to cover a number of services that the population could do, but has chosen to transfer that responsibility to the government. Not good, bad, or evil. We've just, as we've evolved as a society, we've asked the government to do more and more for us, and as such, we've provided them more and more taxation to provide that. Now, the social contract does ask for the service to be sufficient. It needs to meet the requirements of the population, and its modernization and growth is the responsibility of the government, when necessarily supported by additional taxation. And this simply means that when we transfer through the social contract a responsibility to the government to provide us a service, we also transfer the responsibility to maintain that service. So the ongoing upgrading of capability, skills, everything else like that, we leave to the government to do. And periodically the government will need to return to us and say, hey, listen, we want to upgrade this or that, and it's going to cost a little bit more money, so we're going to increase taxation. That's the social contract. This is the basic relationships between the citizens and the government and the politician, really supported by the public service. But in theory, the politicians are there as the guardians sent to oversee the social contract's successful and amenable execution. Now, situations change. The influence of variables alters, but most services under the social contract are reasonably standard. If we think within the emergency response genre, fire, police, and EMS services are provided normally on a mostly per capita basis, with certain capabilities added depending on the situation. A high-rise rescue fire team is likely not necessary in a location where no structure exceeds 50 feet. Some governments will source out singular specialties, like a SWAT team, to a larger agency, paying an annual fee for access to that service in the unlikely event that it's required. Should it become more frequent or necessary within the location, then it may become an organic capability. This is a cycle of service and capability that ebbs and flows in governance, but this is not capacity. Capacity is resource limited. The provision of a service has a limit, after which there is no more resources to provide, irrespective of the situation. Now think about this. If your town has 6 fire trucks and a massive fire breaks out and it requires 7 fire trucks, your local fire department's capacity has been exceeded. They have the capability to provide fire service, but the capacity has been exceeded. There's very important difference between those words. So when that happens, every time, capacity is rarely discussed. Most citizens never consider the point at which the service under the social contract reaches capacity and can no longer be provided, irrespective of the taxation transferred. This is mitigated to some degree by agreements, similar to that fire reference that I just gave, similar to those for specific capabilities with other similar agencies in neighboring locations. So often neighboring fire departments will have mutual assistance agreements saying, hey, listen, when I'm out of fire trucks, for example, all 6 are committed to a fire, and I can need a couple of more with their staff, I can go to my neighboring municipality underneath sharing agreements. They will send over their additional fire trucks if they're available, and then I will reimburse them on a cost recovery basis. This is generally how it's done. On the bad day, though, when the capacity is overwhelmed and the neighboring location cannot help because they are under the influence of the same event, the social contract does break. There is a limit, irrespective of the events occurring, where the state capacity is breached and no assistance is possible. That occurs at a different point for various services, but all have their capacity limit. The state is hesitant to delineate this point, communicate it to the residents, and advise them that as to when they'll be without services. It's just unpopular to do so. It may be seen in some lights as a failure of politicians and the public service who executes the task to be able to do their jobs. It's not that, but the danger when you communicate the limit as to which irrespective of what the need is, the government simply cannot help you. That exists in every genre, but it's dangerous to communicate that clearly to the public, because then the public may say, throw the bums out, as we like to say in an English and a Canadian reference, right? We throw them out. We throw out the politicians because you're supposed to do this, and you said you can't, so out you go. And we'll find somebody who can lie to us and tell us they can, because that's essentially what it would be. But we fall for it repeatedly, over and over again. But preparedness is the totality of cognitive efforts and physical activities undertaken in times of peace and calm in order to be capable of successfully navigating exogenous shocks without external assistance. Common definition is what we support here at Inside My Canoe Head at our parent company, Preparedness Labs Incorporated. However the education is provided, whether it be by a private contractor, a public service, or life skills alone, and it's going to be likely a combination of all three, each resident is prepared to some degree to be self-reliant and self-sufficient. Now, self-reliant is based upon the idea that you have the knowledge and skills to execute a task. Self-sufficiency is you have the capacity to execute that task on your own without external support. So remember, self-reliant and self-sufficient are different just as capability and capacity are. So the capabilities vary, as do their capacity, but population preparedness is measurable. We have the ability to know the extent to which the population has self-reliance and self-sufficiency. Now, the uncomfortable space between state capacity and resident preparedness is referred to as a preparedness gap. I've written a lot about this. I've got a couple of podcast episodes and some previous, I think back to season 5 and 6, where I talk about how to define this gap. It's the place where the social contract breaks and the population is currently untrained to manage. This is measurable by both knowing the preparedness level in the population and the capacity limit of the state. The gap may be communicated to the population as the space in which they will have to navigate to operate without support for an unknown time. So if you think about the preparedness gap as saying, for example, the state has the ability to respond to 5 fires at once. If a 6th fire breaks out, the state will not be able to respond to that. The population does not have the skill set to fight a house fire or the equipment to fight a house fire. That is your gap, right? Because the population, it doesn't mean you can't train the population. It doesn't mean you can't equip the population. It means that the current position you have not. And therefore you have an identifiable knowing. So, hey, listen, population, guess what? Here's the truth I'm going to tell you. We can do 5 fires. We can't do 6. Hopefully you're not 6, but if the 6 happen, we'll be clear to tell you that we wish you the best of luck. We can just tell you to step away and let it burn, save the people, because there's nothing anybody can do from a state capacity to help you. Good luck. Bon chance, as we say en français. But that's known, right? These uncomfortable discussions about the limitations of state capacity are rarely held. Again, like I've said before, largely due to the stress it places on the perceived value of the social contract. The idea that government services are provided to a limited degree and provisions for excess capacity are reliant on external resources is not confidence building in the population, unless, and it can be, unless it is then supported by a communication strategy outlining this piece, informing the population that at a certain point, they're on their own, and here is what you'll need to be able to do without support. Honesty, truth. We call this in the social capital world your activation context. Now, significant research in the past 40 years has conclusively demonstrated the power of the community of social capital. The pooling of resources, the expanding networks, and the trusted relationships to facilitate the transfer of other capitals, physical, human, and financial. If this gap is told, if it's informed truthfully by the state to the population, the community will rise to build the capacity to fill the preparedness gap. It's a logical process of constructing resilience, grounded in truth and social capital. And the rationale for this argument that I place in some of my writings and what I do in my presentations when I go to conferences, I've got a couple of conferences coming up. One national one here in Ottawa where I'm presenting on social capital and the role in whole of community development. And then my literal favorite conference out at Disaster Forum out in Banff, Alberta at the Castle in the Mountains. To talk about the very same thing along with an esteemed, incredible colleague, Scott Cameron from Emergency Management Logistics. We're firm believers in this, in that when the idea of the social contract is you don't have to worry about the provision of services because you've transferred the responsibility to the state for taxation. And for the most part in the day-to-day, they actually do it. If they didn't, you demand an improvement in the services. And it ebbs and flows and goes back and forth, right? If you believe that the state has an unending capacity to deliver this service, and you're unaware that there is a point at which the state is exhausted and cannot help you, you won't make any measures. There's no rationale for you to take on additional education, learning, building your self-reliance and your self-sufficiency. There's no motivation to do so, simply because you think and believe, rightly or wrongly, that you've been told that the state has unlimited capability. Now, I will say, capability and capacity, I will say that often what does occur is that for some strange reason, intentional or otherwise, that a lot of the population has a fairly outsized belief in the capacity and capability of the government. They believe, rightly or wrongly, that the execution ability of the government through this social contract will reach all of the needs that they have, right? And then when the government doesn't and they fail, and we've seen it periodically, this is not ideologically based. Governments of all stripes have failed to deliver a service that the population demanded at a certain time, and the population gets angry. I told you to do this. You were responsible to do this. Why did the government fail to do it? But maybe the government didn't fail. Maybe the government just hit their capacity level and it was breached and there was nothing else. But because they've never communicated it to the population, when they reach that capacity limitation, the population still had this outsized, incorrect belief that the government's assistance would continue to come forth, would continue to go on. So maybe the government didn't fail, but what they did do is not communicate clearly that the fifth fire is our capacity limitation. The sixth fire, if you're that family, your home will burn down to the ground. You will not get any assistance and you will be on your own. And when you get angry that the fire department didn't show up, it's not because the fire department failed. It's not because the government failed. It's because it was not clearly communicated to the population. Now, you might say that's a little bit ridiculous, communicating the number of fires we can happen. But if we extrapolate this to the main idea of this podcast in the world of preparedness and emergency and disaster management, think about Jasper. Think about the massive floods that are happening in the United States of America after the hurricanes that have gone through. Think about earthquake damage in some parts of the world. Think about the point at which literally in sheer moments, state capacity is utterly, totally consumed. It's done in sheer minutes. If you're wondering about the Canadian context, there's a great Fault Lines, which is a great podcast that's still available. It was put up by CBC some almost 10 years ago now by Heino Wagstaff, a wonderful, incredibly intelligent meteorologist and seismologist, talks about what the reality on the ground would be like when the big one hits the western coast. When on the Ring of Fire down the western coast of North America, so Canada and the western United States, and they have the massive big one, the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake happens, what it will really look like on the ground, right? And she tells the truth of the first 24 hours is the emergency services rescuing themselves. They're not going out to help a soul. They're simply rescuing themselves because the fire stations, the ambulance stations, the police stations, they're all coming down on top of themselves, right? Because most of the modern, if they're not modern buildings, they're going to have to rescue themselves to some degree. So other than if you're luckily standing next to a paramedic, the first 24 hours, there's nobody to help anybody. And it's likely up to 72 hours before any assistance can be organized. And for that case alone, one of my previous jobs before I retired in the military was I had access to the government response plans, the federal government, the Canadian Armed Forces response plans to that. And let me just put it this way. You could not put a worse place and a harder place to access. Being a professional logistician, I'm all about the movements of goods, services, and troops from one location to another, right? The Canadian Army's on the wrong side of the Rockies, let's put it that way. You got a brigade of 4,000, 5,000 soldiers sitting in Edmonton. It's on the wrong side of the Rockies. None of the roads are likely going to be passable. None of the river systems are going to be passable through the landslides, etc. And none of the rail lines will be passable. And a good portion of the airports will be gone. So how are you getting in, right? Long conversation, but the point being is we have this outsized belief. So if that was to occur, an immediate response wasn't given to the people of the Lower Mainland BC, the idea would be the government failed. But in fact, they didn't. They did everything that was within their capability and capacity to respond. Just the event extraordinarily exceeded in that case. But if we look at the local case, you can have where capacity is exceeded and you don't know. But the research that I've done, talking to people in the Canadian province of Ontario, which is generally where most of my disaster research is grounded, and research that's been done through some pretty eminent scholars that are far eons above me in depth and breadth of publications in this matter, is basically have said, hey, listen, it's the power of social capital, right? It's the power of your community. When people are aware that they're going to be on their own, people build that capacity. They build the trusted relationships. They build the organization. They build community resilience because they have to, right? Because the impetus is there, the catalyst is there, the knowledge is there, the awareness is there that nobody is coming to help them, right? That they are going to be on their own. And like I said, everybody is prepared to some degree. It's going to change all over the map depending on who they are, what level they're at, whether they care or not. I've got a 5-level development index that I've done for preparedness levels to categorize people within a population. But basically, people are prepared to some degree, but that prepared level is not high enough. I've never measured it anywhere where it's anywhere near high enough to meet the capacity gap or the preparedness gap that happens when the state capacity is gone. But when you inform people of this, you start to see brilliant things happening within the population. You start to see community groups pop up. It's a concern to me. It's a concern to you. Let's get together and figure out how we're going to deal with this, right? And it's neighbors. It's social capital. It's your friends. It's your community. It's those trusted, fostering relationships that you build, right? It's the old adage I say all the time. And I use this example in conference presentations when I give it. I say, hey, listen, you live in a townhouse row, right? Your neighbor, Bob, wants to borrow your lawnmower, right? Probably going to, Bob. Bob lives 1 or 2 doors down. You see them regularly. You know them by name. You wave at them. Bob needs your lawnmower. You're going to lend Bob your lawnmower, right? You have a reasonable expectation, a norm of reciprocity, a trusted relationship, and you know where Bob lives, right? So Bob's going to borrow your lawnmower. It's not going to cause a big problem. That existed trusted relationship had to exist first before the physical capital of the lawnmower could transfer along that relationship. Tim comes up. You don't know who Tim is. Tim says he lives 15 houses down. You might or might not have seen him before, and Tim wants to borrow your lawnmower. That is going to be a far more difficult loan for you to do than your neighbor next door, right? Your close established relationship. Now, if you extrapolate that from individuals to groups and you build a strong network, that's how resilience grows within communities. Communities realize they're on their own. They realize they're going to have to execute a certain number of tasks on their own. They realize they have to build both the capability and the capacity to do that, and then they build it, and it's brilliant. They don't need somebody else to come in. They're humans are very resourceful, very intelligent, have a lot of wisdom. And when you put a bunch of really smart people, you put a bunch of residents together on a street and you say, we've got this problem and we need to solve it. Let's figure it out. You'll come to a community consensus as to how to address it. You'll come to a plan. People will agree to commit resources and people will agree to work together to do it. It's brilliant. It costs no money. But that resilience building in the community doesn't start if the belief is, universally held that that responsibility is done by government and that government's capacity is endless, right? There is no initiative. There is no rationale. There's no motivation. There's no logic for you to undertake a community resilience building activity when you believe wholeheartedly and irrationally, some would say, that the government's capacity is there and will come and rescue you in the dime of day. You can transfer this to economic programs, income support programs that showed up during the pandemic. People had the belief that it was the government's responsibility to step in and pay their bills for them or help them pay their bills when a pandemic was going on, when the government had nothing to do with the pandemic. There was that transferred belief that somehow it was the government's responsibility to do that, right? Now, governments did do that, and I've written in the past that it's highly unlikely if we were to have another pandemic in the short order that the governments would repeat that. I doubt, considering the economic pain that it caused through inflation, I highly doubt that they would do that. But that's a different preparedness question. We talk about that in our many episodes here at Preparedness Labs Incorporated and on this podcast, Inside My Canoe Head, about your responsibility to have a plan when you're fired. But that, my friends, today it's all about just understanding that I would encourage you, if you walk away from this podcast episode with nothing else, and thank you for staying to this point. If you walk away from nothing else, it's just sit back and reflect on that social contract you have with your government, the services you expect your government to provide for you, and then have a thought as to what the capacity limitations are. And then that informs, hey, listen, if that's reached, am I able to step up and step in? And if I'm not, maybe it's something that myself and my neighbors should talk about, because I've said it again. I put up some social media yesterday about lone wolves die and wolf packs survive. It's the order of nature. If you have a preparedness gap to fill, if you have a capacity limitation that you need to be able to manage once the state capacity is exceeded, you will be far more successful if you do this as a community, as a tribe, and not as a lone wolf individual. This is not a call for you as an individual to try to be able to fill the gap the state walks away from when their capacity is reached, right? No, it's illogical, it's irrational, and we are tribal species, right? We are a tribal, community-based species, have been since time immemorial. We're not lone bears rolling through the roof, okay? That's not who we are. So build your community, build your social capital, leverage that for understanding that gap, and then have that capacity and the capability to step in when the state reaches its capacity and it simply cannot help you anymore. That's your responsibility. Hopefully you enjoyed today's episode. Please drop over to insidemycanoehead.ca, our hosted website. All of our episodes are there. We have everything else, some other points, some interesting stuff there. There is an ability for you to drop in and drop me $5. If you think that you love this podcast and would like to support it by doing nothing more than buying me a coffee, there's a link there. I am fueled by wonderful, simple black coffee, veteran-powered, veteran-owned. I buy my coffee from incredible businesses started up by warriors who have now retired. So buy me a coffee. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Take care. Stay safe.